Hello, and welcome back to It's a Very Exciting Time, a podcast by a UFO nerd and its tolerant friend. My name is Scott, and I've been fascinated by the phenomenon my whole life.
And my name is Chuck. I'm an aerospace nerd and a tolerant friend.
We started this podcast because since 2017, there have been shocking revelations, from news of secret Pentagon programs to confirmed Navy videos of astonishing craft. In a nutshell, now that the government has admitted that UFOs are real,
Or at least that the videos were authentic.
it raises a natural question. If UFOs are real, what else? Suddenly, some of these other parts of the phenomenon that seemed unlikely are pulled into the realm of the possible.
Right? They may still be unlikely. But there's so many explanations for these stories. Even if the truth is more mundane than you're hoping, if any of it turns out to be true, whew.
Woo! It's a very exciting time.
Hey, Scott. So I heard something about the government shooting down a balloon. Is that would that be classified as UAP? Is there any juice in there about that? How's the community reacting right now?
Oh man, buddy, Reddit is having a field day with this Chinese balloon and the
Sure.
successive two UFOs that the U.S. has shot down.
Wait, what?
Yeah, yeah,
That's not what I had heard. Okay, cool. So what's going
buddy,
on?
it's been a wild week. Now, I want to temper this by saying, when I say UFO, I mean in the strictest sense. There was an object, it was flying, and it's
Okay.
unidentified, and they shot it down. I am not saying they
Did
shot down two alien craft.
okay, but did they have any of the five criteria?
Oh, man, I've trained you well. That is a great question. And the short answer is no, they did not.
Okay.
And
Okay.
every indication is these are conventional but unidentified. So let me give you a
Okay.
brief breakdown. Okay. So about a week ago, on Saturday the 4th, the US shot down a Chinese spy balloon off the coast of North Carolina. You almost
Okay.
certainly heard about this. It was all over
Yeah.
the news. It did a complete overflight of the US, which really upset all the conservative, right wing kind of hawk figures in the government. Like, why would you just let this go? Well,
Right.
the reason why they let it fly over the US is because when we say balloon, you're probably picturing like a weather balloon, like maybe one
Right.
of those big balloons
Yeah.
that hangs over a car dealership. No,
Yeah.
this balloon was 200 feet tall, carrying a payload the size of a
Tall?
bus. Yeah, like a
Huh.
big circular balloon, 200 feet.
I would have
Uh,
imagined Zeppelin shaped, not tall. That's
no,
so
it was a big
interesting.
circle, big circle.
Okay, a
And
big
it had
circle with
this,
like lines coming down, or
yeah,
like
yeah,
just a
lines hanging off the
200
bottom,
foot wide.
supporting, that like metal scaffolding that they put up over the stage at rock band conferences
Yeah,
that'll
yeah, yeah,
hold
yeah.
up like the big speakers. It looked like it
Okay.
had one of those crossbars dangling from it,
Now
about the
I'm
size.
imagining like lighting gear and
Dude,
disco
seriously,
balls
you
and
should just Google a photo of it real fast because it's
okay, all
crazy.
right.
So anyway, it has this payload the size of a bus, which they estimated was weighing more than a couple thousand pounds dangling from it. So as you can imagine,
Wow.
they didn't want to just pop this balloon over a city and let it fall on someone.
Yeah,
So whether or not it was a good idea to let what is inarguably a spy balloon overfly the entire nation, they did, and
right.
they eventually shot it down off the coast of South Carolina. Um,
Okay.
because this turned into kind of a weirdly political firestorm, uh, White House officials were kind of on defense about it. They were saying, look, it poses little intelligence gathering and military risk. But at the same time, the balloon flew close to several prominent sites related to the US nuclear arsenal. It
Yeah.
had multiple antennas capable of gathering signal intelligence and solar panels to power its multiple activity intelligence collection sensors. Uh,
Okay.
US officials have maintained that the balloon's ability to collect more information than Chinese satellites was limited. I think that's
Yeah.
what it really boils down to. I saw the photo of this thing and they're saying, oh, its intelligence gathering capability is limited. I'm like, is it? Because I could strap an iPhone to a balloon and gather a lot of intelligence and beam it home to me. Like, we don't need
Totally.
size to gather good
Yeah.
information or send and receive signals anymore. But
Yeah.
what I think they're comparing it to is there are Chinese spy satellites and they fly
Yeah.
over our country every day. Is this
Yeah.
able to do more than a spy satellite? And the
I
answer,
mean,
as far as they seem to think, was no, not really. We're not overly concerned.
from a aerospace point of view, like being that much closer to the ground makes it a lot easier.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
it
there
is
is that.
true. It is true. Like every single week, I watch space news, and there is a classified launch from China,
Hmm.
from the Chinese military. So presumably, they're launching new spy sats once a week.
Yeah,
And and if you got 2 tons,
right.
you can do a lot of stuff with that. But
Yeah.
then you have to get the signal home, and that's
So
a pain.
all that is to say, this thing was a big deal. It was in the news all
Yeah,
week. There were civilian photographs of it. Like people are like taking photos of it
yeah,
from the street and stuff. Everybody's kind of up in
yeah.
arms about it. They get shot down. Honestly, if that had been it, it probably would have been fine. It would have been a story of the week, no big deal. Then, less than a week later, on Friday the 10th, uh, an unidentified object was shot down by a US F-22 over Alaskan airspace. It had
Hmm.
been monitored by the US since Thursday evening, meaning it was picked up on radar. Uh, it was flying at 40,000 feet. The Chinese spy satellite was at 60,000 feet. For
Okay.
reference, if you're like me and don't carry these facts and figures around, commercial aircraft fly at 30 to 45,000 feet. So
Yeah.
40,000 feet is firmly in the territory of flight risk. Uh, they sent up pilots to observe it. Those pilots were able to determine that it was unmanned. Interestingly, they gave different accounts of what they observed, and some of them said it interfered with their sensors. Now, this next bit is what raised the interest of UFO Reddit. It was described as cylindrical, silverish gray, and about the size of a small car. Well,
Was
that
it
sure
Tic
sounds
Tac
like our
shaped?
Tic Tac, buddy.
Yeah.
Uh, However, it was also described as floating and not
Hmm.
maneuvering.
Okay.
Uh, National Security Council official John Kirby gave a press briefing. He said the U.S. does not know who owns the object, and at the time he said, and he would not call it a balloon. He said, we're
Hmm.
calling this an object because that's the best description we have right now. We do not know who owns it, whether it's state owned, corporate owned, or privately owned. We just don't know. This is only notable in comparison to the Chinese balloon a week before, which was immediately and clearly identified as Chinese.
Yeah.
So we don't know who owns
Yeah.
it.
And actually, do we know how they knew it was Chinese?
I don't know that,
Um,
but they
I
were
know
they were
it's
saying that very confidently, and they
okay.
have
I
since
know it was
recovered the
spotted
records.
by yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I know it was spotted by the U-2 plane, which is a pretty fun plane. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I love that the U-2's max altitude is 70K
Right.
feet, which is like okay, cool. Still
Totally.
got that edge on balloons. Um,
Yeah.
okay,
So
cool. So it wasn't
uh,
like
he said it
yeah,
was not able to move like the Chinese balloon, which was news to me. I hadn't heard this about the Chinese balloon. He said the first one was able to maneuver and loiter, slow down, and speed up,
sure.
which makes it sound a lot more like an airship than just
Yeah,
a weather
right,
balloon, which you kind of throw up and let it go with the weather patterns. He said
right.
that first balloon was very purposeful. This one is described as floating or drifting.
Hmm.
Air Force Brigadier General Pat Ryder said, we have no further details about the object at this time, including any description of its capabilities, purpose, or origin.
Okay.
Now, notably, unlike the other one, this did not have a collection platform dangling off of it. So
Right,
it
yeah.
may very well have been a balloon, but if it was, where's all the stuff? Like, what is it
Yeah.
for? You know?
Right.
So it doesn't appear to be able to maneuver. It doesn't appear to have like obvious collection stuff on it. So it's very different than the Chinese balloon, but it's still weird. And it was up there. And because
Yeah.
it was at flight safety height, they ended up shooting it down.
I wonder
Now,
if we're gonna see a YouTube from Mark Rober about like accidentally losing a record-setting balloon or something,
that would be amazing.
right?
Okay, now again, I think this story probably would have turned into nothing. It just would have been lumped in as more of the same,
Yeah.
except on Saturday, the 11th, yesterday for us, another unidentified object was shot down by an F-22, this time over the Yukon in Canada. It had been monitored in Alaskan airspace by the US since Friday evening, and when it crossed into Canadian airspace, the Prime Minister ordered NORAD to shoot it down. A US jet was the first to respond. The object appears to be cylindrical and smaller than the Chinese balloon. Chuck Schumer, who was speaking to the press about this, says he was briefed by the White House and said it's likely another balloon.
Hmm.
Given that this one seems to kind of match the description of the first, seems likely that both of them were balloons, but somehow different than the big Chinese
Yeah.
spy balloon. So
Hmm.
that's the story. I've
Okay.
got a couple of reactions here that I want to share with you, but like, it's weird, right? Like,
Well, that's what I don't know. Like, I don't know how the military operates when, like, admittedly, this was like university security. I was
Mhm,
shocked when we did our report and found out like how often like crime happened on that campus. I don't know how often the
mhm.
military shoots down UFOs and stray
Buddy,
balloons and like,
you hit the nail on the head. There is an article out there right now talking
okay,
about this is a weirdly, unprecedentedly
okay,
aggressive stance for us to take. We don't shoot down
okay,
unidentified things floating through our airspace. Um, it's important to remember the context also that Biden had just
yeah,
taken a lot of heat for not shooting
yeah,
down the Chinese spy balloon earlier. So, arguably, this was a low risk target that didn't need to be shot down, but he scores a few political points by going, see, I can shoot things down
okay,
when it's not a risk to
right,
civilian safety. But yeah, it is weird that we've suddenly started shooting down random balloons. Like
yeah,
these don't have the hallmarks of state agency like spy satellites,
yeah,
which makes you wonder, are we shooting down someone's science project?
yeah,
you
right,
know? And yeah, I don't know how many are going up. Now, the next part of this that's really interesting is Chris Mellon, UFO Daddy, uh, tweeted, you know, it's amazing what you can find when you start looking. And he talked about something we've talked about briefly before, which is reportedly the software filters on our air radars filter out pretty much anything that's not an ICBM or a cruise missile. Like, that's what
makes
those
sense.
radar stations are there for. They're to detect nuclear war. They don't really care
Yeah,
about balloons because they're not nuclear war. Uh,
yeah.
Hence, NORAD failed to report balloon overflights during the Trump administration, but could identify the radar tracks when they pulled the stored data later. That
Oh,
is a
interesting.
fascinating quote because it implies that,
Yeah,
yes, absolutely, balloon overflights are not a new thing. They have been happening at
right.
least since the Trump administration,
Yeah.
and our radar just wasn't calibrated to detect it. He makes the point that arguably the rise of the like kind of reduction in stigma in talking about intrusions in our airspace by UAP has led directly to our ability to detect incursions that were happening and we were unaware of because they didn't match our profile of a jet or a
Right.
missile.
Right. Yeah. So I think there's something else really interesting in there from the aerospace angle that I know you wouldn't have picked up on. Um, the storage of like the old radar logs
Mhm,
says a little bit about how the military is actually running their radar, and it
mhm,
says that
mhm.
there's a separation. There's a thing called software defined radio. I
Yeah.
have to assume that they're similar in radar, where you have a like general like promiscuous radio that's recording everything, and
I
then
know
I know
that's a technical
promiscuous is
term,
like
but
I know,
ooh, it's a slutty
yeah,
radio.
exactly. Uh, but yeah, they can later apply an SDR on top of that signal. Is really it's a great way to do it.
Mhm.
But yeah, it does mean that we could apply new radios to old
Mhm.
logs, and um, which I'm actually surprised that they admitted that, because
Yeah,
that's like a important detail.
right.
Um, but also, I don't know, could be really cool for us because they might be able to redefine the SDR to detect
Exactly.
other things.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
Now, Chris goes on to talk about, because he was on Twitter, so of course every rando in the world is attacking him like, ah, you said they were all UFOs, and this one's a balloon. And he says, no, look, this is. I suspect that these ones probably have been balloons, but with
yeah,
increased situational awareness, who knows what else we'll find. I expect most UAP incidents have very prosaic explanations. Likely the
sure,
case with these recent shootdowns, less so with the Nimitz case.
yeah,
And that brings it back to the question you asked at the beginning. For me, I find myself increasingly going back to that idea of the five observables. If we see something
yeah,
that we can't identify, but it is not doing anything weird, I tend to fall on the idea that it's probably not weird. Like, hey,
right,
if you see something floating through the airspace, but it's not making right angle turns at, G forces that a human can't withstand, if it's not
yeah,
traveling between mediums like outer space and the water, if it's not
right,
turning invisible and pranking our pilots,
right.
yeah, it probably
Yeah,
is just
maybe
a
it's
balloon,
fine.
and a lot of them probably are. So I
Yeah,
I
right.
think it's really interesting that Chris was able to come out on top of this and be like, yeah, absolutely. This is a good thing. It shows that recalibrating our radar to pay more attention to UFOs as opposed to just ignoring them revealed intrusions in our airspace that we were previously unaware of. And it just goes to show that there are things up there and we need to pay attention to it. If they all turn out to be
Yeah,
prosaic, I mean, that's great, frankly, but sticking our head in the
yeah,
sand and ignoring them isn't an option. Uh,
yeah.
there's one last quote I want to close with here. Someone named Ashley K on Reddit posted this. Said, someone is learning a lot about US Canadian response to intrusion of airspace, response time, base assigned to respond, type of aircraft to respond, radar tracking and identification time, probably search radio frequencies, definitely fire control radar terminal guidance frequency, and duration of the terminal guidance phase, communication and decision making protocols before interceptor dispatch, same for authorization for a kill shot, all of that for the price of a balloon or a UAV, someone's getting quite a
Hell
bargain.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because I was like,
yeah,
why would China be sending over spy balloons? Like that's a weird tech. They have satellites. Like, sure,
yeah,
it's closer to the ground, but it's a weird thing. This comment kind of puts it in perspective for me. Like,
yeah,
okay,
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And this, like the Chinese balloon feels like one of those I feel like China is so likely to claim their thing and plaster the flag on the side and
yeah,
they make sure you know it's them. This feels more like one of those North Korean things where it's like,
yeah,
oh, China can do it, we can do it too. And
right.
and the people who actually learn about it are probably China. But
I'm also
uh
imagining, some guy who had this like balloon reconnaissance probing program that everybody kind of thought was ridiculous, going in to report to his general. He's like, "You're not going to believe this. They didn't detect any of them. They all just
yeah,
flew straight over the continental U.S. Like nobody noticed. Like they
yeah.
just noticed one now for the first time in 4 years. Like,
40 years, right? Like who
you're
knows?
right.
Yeah,
So yeah,
absolutely. Either that or it's just someone in Alaska who's trolling. Feels like a very Alaskan thing.
it does feel very Alaskan. Yeah. All right. So anyway, all that is to
Yeah.
say, I came to this episode with a whole agenda ready to talk about this thing, and instead, the U.S. has been shooting down UFOs all week. Now,
Huh.
I think they are balloons. I don't think
Yeah.
they're weird, exotic, extraplanetary stuff, but it is related, at least tangentially, to the UFO field. I think it was worth talking about. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, it's been a weird week, buddy.
Yeah, right. So what are we going to talk about today?
Oh, well, I'm going to start with a quote.
Okay.
We are here today to disclose the truth about a subject that has been ridiculed, questioned, and denied for at least 50 years. The men and women on this stage and the some 350 additional military intelligence witnesses to the so-called UFO matter and extraterrestrial intelligence can prove and will prove that we are not alone.
Hmm.
That was the
Okay.
opening statement from Steven Greer at a 2001 National Press Club event, which was kind of the kickoff event for a project he started called the Disclosure Project. Um,
Hmm.
Steven Greer is today a very controversial figure in the UFO field. Um, it is
Yeah.
really common to see. I have all the respect in the world for the work he did back in 2001, but he is now clearly a nut job and should not be listened to. That's kind of like the vibe across. Uh,
Okay.
Astronaut Edgar Mitchell, who also has a lot of pull in the UFO community, was quoted as saying, I cooperated with Steven Greer some years ago. That's an understatement. The whole Wilson Davis memo, that was
Yeah.
Steven Greer and Edgar Mitchell meeting with Admiral Wilson.
Okay. That is a few years. Yeah.
Yeah, I cooperated with Steven Greer some years ago, but he began to overreach his data continuously, necessitating
Hmm.
withdrawal by myself and I believe several others. I have requested to be removed from any website announcements, etc., but I see that has not taken place. Now,
Yeah.
I just wanted to get that out of the way because the
Okay.
instant you talk about Steven Greer, people come out of the woodwork trying to dismiss everything he said. This is the one thing that Steven Greer has done that I think should be taken seriously. This is before he
When
kind of went off the deep end.
okay, that's what I was going to ask. How far before the deep end was this?
It's unclear. So, for example, in
Okay.
recent years, Steven Greer, if you've ever heard the term CE5,
Yeah, I think you've mentioned that, but
right?
what
So, Close Encounters of the Third Kind was a movie, but that title comes from an actual rating system that they made up in Project Blue
oh,
Book. So
okay.
Close Encounters of the First Kind is like I saw a UFO. Close Encounters of the Second Time is like I interacted with the UFO. Close Encounters of the Third Kind is I interacted with the occupants of a UFO.
Oh, okay.
CE5 is Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, and it represents human initiated contact. It
Oh, I
is
thought it was
a
like I became a resident of a UFO.
yeah, yeah. I think
Or
that's
I am
CE4.
the
Yeah.
UFO.
But
Okay.
yeah, so CE5 is all about like making psychic contact with them and summoning them to come and land.
Oh.
Stephen Greer sells tapes and books and hosts retreats that cost quite a lot of money, where he takes you out
Mm.
into the woods and whatever, and you all sit around a fire and meditate and summon a UFO.
Okay.
The community is reasonably confident that they have strong evidence that he faked at least one of these encounters,
Yep.
that he hired a plane to fly offshore and drop military flares, which tend to drop very slowly and burn out.
Right.
And then he's telling everybody, "Oh, look, we summoned a UFO." Now, I wasn't there. I don't know. But that is the conventional wisdom in the community. Stephen Greer is a scam artist.
Okay.
I tend to go with Edgar Mitchell on this, that Stephen Greer started out legitimately enough. This 2001 press conference, kind of when he came onto the stage, it seems
Mm.
to be legit. He did a really good job. He got a lot of people, and we'll talk about his goals there. And I think after that, he kind of is riding a little high on his own fame. And he kind of
Right.
starts to reach a little too far, starts to say a little too much. He put out a
Mm.
documentary uh, about the Atacama mummy, which was this weird humanoid
Mm.
mummy that they found up in the mountains. Long story short, he's like, this is clearly an alien, and he lines up all these
Right.
people to say it's alien. He films a documentary about it. Frickin' Gary Nolan, who we will be talking about more later, comes in and agrees to do biological testing of it and demonstrates conclusively that it was human, just a really
Yeah.
unfortunate, probably premature birth with a bunch of conditions. And
Right.
anyway, so Stephen
Yeah.
Greer,
Okay.
controversial for a reason. I think this press conference is legit, and we're going to talk about it.
Yeah, and so we can focus on the legitimacy of the people who are talking rather than
Mhm,
Stephen
mhm.
Greer, right?
Yeah. There was a really interesting question that came up at the end of the press conference. So Stephen Greer introduces it. I'll talk about his introduction in a minute. I'll give you a summary of a handful of the witnesses because he had
Okay.
21 people get up and talk that day. It took
Yeah.
2 hours. I'm not going to do all of that here. But
Okay.
one of the questions they asked afterwards is, how do you know these people are legit? What sort of vetting have you done? And basically, he says,
Mm,
look, I used to be an ER doctor. People come to you telling you they're in pain. Are there people who come to you and lie so they can get opioids? Yes, that happens. But over time, you have to kind of like develop a vibe for it. I
sure.
have enough of these people and enough corroborating witnesses and enough data to feel confident in the data set as a whole. Does that mean
Hmm,
nobody in here is lying? No, I can't tell you that. Maybe someone
right.
is lying, but I am confident on the whole. That seems to be the vibe of the community towards this press conference. A
Okay.
handful of the people who've spoken have since been discredited. Some of the more extreme things are a little hard to take, but on the whole, they paint a picture that is very in line with what you and I have kind of been coming to understand, and especially in line with what we heard in the Admiral Wilson memo. The idea that
Okay.
there have been crash retrievals of intelligently piloted extraterrestrial craft. There's been a reverse engineering effort. Um, Basically, there has been contact with extraterrestrial life, and the US government and military has suppressed this truth.
So the witnesses aren't like military personnel
No,
or
they are.
trained observers. Like, oh, okay,
Yeah,
some of them
yeah,
are, or all
absolutely.
of them are.
Yeah, why don't I dive into this? Because
Yeah. Yeah.
he
Okay.
kind of
Cool.
explains all this in the introduction. So,
Okay.
uh, in 2001, he holds an event at the National Press Club in DC where over 20 military, intelligence, government, corporate, and scientific witnesses gave testimony about UFOs. This was the first time he'd kind of come out. The Disclosure Project, which did this, had been in existence for a few years, but they weren't really super public about it. So this is their
Okay.
kind of public outing. He says
They
he's
hadn't
been working,
disclosed it.
right. He says he's been working with a group of military advisors working towards assembling witnesses to disclose the truth about UFOs. Um, if you listen to Stephen Greer talk for more than about 2 minutes, you will notice he has a very um, braggadocious way of talking about himself. Uh,
Mm, good word.
he really likes to talk up his credentials. One of the quotes I have here, he says, since that time, I have personally briefed a sitting director of Central Intelligence, the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, the head of Intelligence Joint Staff, members of the Senate Intelligence Committee, many members of Congress, members of the European leadership, the Japanese cabinet, and others. And what I have found is that none of them are surprised that this is true, but they are uniformly horrified that they have not had access to these projects. Now, when he
Hmm,
says this in 2001, you hear this list of all these people he's briefed, and you're like, why would the White House, why would Congress be getting briefings from this rando ER doctor? That doesn't make any sense.
right. Yeah.
And in fact, several of the people that he claims to have briefed have come out and discredited him and said no. There's one particularly interesting case. I forget the guy's name, but Stephen Greer says, I briefed this guy. The cover story was me and my wife went to have dinner at his house with him and his wife and some members of his staff. But the actual reason we were there was to brief him.
Mm,
And of course, the senator comes out and says, I don't know what you're talking about. Me and my wife listened politely while you raved about UFOs for a couple hours
yep.
at
There it
our
is.
dinner party.
Uh-huh.
He's not
Uh-huh.
disputing that the meeting took place. He's disputing it being characterized as a briefing. And I think a lot
Briefing.
of these
Yeah.
happen like this. The topic has such a stigma that, some of these briefings are real. Maybe Stephen Greer takes them a
Maybe.
little more seriously than the person who's receiving the briefing, but I
Uh-huh.
think they did happen. And I think the single most credible thing here is we have since found out that the biggest one he talks about when he says he briefed the head of the DIA, he's talking about Admiral Wilson. We now know that meeting actually happened exactly as he described it. Now, whether or not Admiral Wilson actually went out and got access to programs that was denied access, whether or not he actually met with Eric Wilson later, the initial meeting at the Pentagon between
Right.
Edgar Mitchell, Steven Greer, Admiral Wilson, and a few others, that is confirmed. That actually happened. So,
Hmm.
as with everything with Steven Greer, I tend to take him at about 70 to 80%, right? Like he's
Oh,
going
that
to take
high.
a true story and kind of exaggerate it up. He's going to punch it up
Yeah.
a bit, make him sound a little cooler than he actually is. I think
Yeah.
basically people like Admiral Wilson agree to meet with Stephen Greer because someone like Edgar Mitchell comes with him and has enough cachet
Uh-huh.
to get in the front door. What happens
Yeah.
after that meeting? Up for debate.
Doesn't seem like a lot happens after it, right?
Well,
Otherwise,
it depends. And again, we get back to the stigma around all of this. Like a lot of these
yeah,
people,
sure.
Admiral Wilson has been very clear, like, if you tell anyone about this, I will deny it because it's
Yeah.
bad for his career and bad for the people around him. Does that mean it didn't happen? Does it mean the person who said that Admiral Wilson would lie about it is lying? Like we get into
Yeah.
weird psychological territory here. I'm
Oh,
inclined
I
to
mean,
believe the meeting happened.
yeah. I am also inclined to believe that Stephen Greer and that person were in the same room at one point or another. Uh, but all I'm saying is more that the data presented by Stephen Greer was not like interesting enough to overwhelm the like stigma and the challenges of actually using
Sure.
it. It
Yeah,
wasn't
yeah, yeah.
um, like it wasn't good enough for their career or whatever
Hmm, hmm.
to be useful. And I think that's what the band guy was really good at. Um, uh, who's the Blink 182 guy? Um,
I could have told you right until you asked. Oh my God, how did I forget his name? A Tongalong. Jesus Christ.
so I think he was really good at like making the case in a way that
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
the like military individuals actually could care about, and maybe Stephen Greer's
totally.
garbage at it, which is too
Okay.
bad.
So Stephen Greer goes on to say, and he talks for like 20 minutes, by the way. Like I'm going to read like five or
Yeah.
six quotes here, and I'm giving you the short version of what he said.
Okay.
But
Thank you.
he kind of summarizes everything that happens at the press conference. He
Mhm.
says, we can establish that these objects of extraterrestrial origins have been tracked on radar going thousands of miles per hour, stopping, making right-hand turns, that they use anti-gravity propulsion systems, which we have already figured out how they work in classified projects in the US, the UK, and elsewhere, that these objects have landed on terra firma, at times have been disabled, and have been retrieved specifically by teams within the US, that extraterrestrial life forms have been retrieved, and their vehicles have been taken and studied thoroughly for at least 50 years. This is another one of those things. When he said this in 2001, it was an extreme radical claim. Several of the things he says have since come out and been not necessarily validated, but we have heard it from multiple different sources. The
Okay.
behavior of UFOs in particular, the five observables, he hits on a bunch of them. That has
Okay.
since been
Yeah.
verified. The idea of crash retrievals is still super controversial, but there's a
Yeah.
hell of a lot of smoke for there to be no fire. The idea
Hmm.
of recovered life forms, I'm still kind of on the fence about that one, but like if we're recovering craft, it's only like one step further to get there. But in 2001, this was a big, big claim. It came off real heavy. In
Hmm.
hindsight, it doesn't seem like he's claiming anything all that controversial. But again, I want to say, 20 plus years ago, this was a much bigger deal.
Yeah, that makes sense.
He goes on to say, I wish to emphasize that there is no evidence that these life forms from elsewhere are hostile towards us. But there is a great deal of evidence that they are concerned with our hostility. There are times when they have neutralized or rendered inert the launch capabilities of ICBMs. They have shown clearly that they do not want us to weaponize space, and yet we are proceeding down that dangerous path. Now, this is another one. You and I haven't talked about it a lot, but there are two really good books out there on this subject, which are both kind of building off of Steven Greer's press conference here. Uh, UFOs and Nukes, which is kind of a groundbreaking treaty. It's like 10 years old at this point. And Leslie Kane's book, I think it's just called UFOs, but it's about military witnesses. And in both of those books, they back up this claim that
Hmm.
UFOs have surveilled, at least actively interfered at times with military capacities, especially nuclear weapons. Steven Greer has a particular take on this. They don't want us to weaponize space. I'm not 100% sure that I see the evidence for that. I see evidence that they seem to be extremely interested, possibly concerned, although that's reading into motivation, in with our nuclear weapons. Taking that up to whether or not they think we shouldn't weaponize space, I think that's a reasonable assumption, but I don't think there's necessarily evidence attached to that claim. But he makes a big
Yeah.
deal about that. That's one of his big things.
Hmm.
He says these witnesses have been involved in black budget or covert projects. These projects take in 40 to 80 billion dollars per year. They are sitting on tech that could solve the energy crisis and end global warming. He says, we can prove that this subject has been hidden from members of Congress and at least two presidential administrations, and that the Constitution of the US has been subverted by the growing power of these classified projects, and that this is a danger to national security. These projects, because they have not been supervised properly, have become a threat to national security. For this reason,
Hmm.
we feel we must disclose the facts. This has become
Yeah.
pretty
It's pretty compelling.
uncontroversial in
Yeah.
the UFO community. People
Yeah.
believe different things about whether or not we
Yeah.
have reverse engineered vehicles, whether or not we have treaties with aliens, whether or not we have ever spoken to a living alien, whether or not there's been any success. But the idea that something has been recovered, it has been kept off the books, and it is no longer in control of the people who are supposed to control it is a narrative we are hearing increasingly from many, many different sources. And
Sure.
that feels like something that is starting to become less controversial. The instant
Yeah.
you go beyond what are they keeping secret and what have they done with it, there's a million possibilities. But this idea that
Yeah.
sort of a rogue group that may have started with the best of intentions, but eventually kind of slipped out from under the bounds of normal protocols, seems to be an increasingly uncontroversial claim. But again,
I
at the time, he's out there with this.
Yeah, right. So like I find it hard to believe the 40 to 80 billion. Um, like NASA's budget is for like almost 15 billion. Like it just seems hard
I've
to
heard,
believe that they're
yeah,
yeah, I don't know.
I will admit, I am not a budget authority. I'm not a military
Sure.
authority, but I have heard this from many, many different sources that
Okay.
there are a lot of kind of black budget programs. And there's big chunks of the US military budget that if you were to look at the budget are basically just a black box. This much money here, don't worry about it. They're for unacknowledged
Okay.
special access projects. Now those are the ones that are on the books. Like there is a project, but it is unacknowledged. It is a category, and you aren't cleared to know about it. Just know that the military is sending $10 million to this project or whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know where he got 40 to 80 billion dollars, but I don't find it that hard to
Well,
believe. What's the military's budget? Like it's trillions, right?
uh, well, this Wikipedia mentions 700 billion.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
It does look like there's a Washington Post article from 2013 that talks about it being 7% of that,
Mhm.
which is like 50 billion. So maybe
All right.
maybe it's
Okay,
right.
Steven Greer. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. I guess
Like I
you got me
said,
this time.
I tend to not put a whole lot of stock in any individual claim that he
Yeah.
makes,
Right.
but the broader pattern, the bigger picture he's painting, I find myself having a hard time disagreeing.
Yeah.
And
Totally.
now we get to the meat of it. So he's closing in on the end of his introduction. He says, "This is the beginning of the campaign for disclosure. Our goals are as follows: that we have open and honest hearings on the subject in the US Congress." Okay, good goal. We have kind of hit that point. We're not quite there yet, but it feels like we are very much on that trajectory. So, Stephen Greer, 1 for 1 so far, not bad. Two, that there would be a permanent ban on the weaponization of space or the targeting of any objects of extraterrestrial origin. Yeah,
Hmm.
swing and a miss, buddy. I,
Yeah,
I
that
don't
hasn't
think we've
happened.
super weaponized it, but we are not weaponizing it.
Oh yeah, it's weaponized.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, and that there be a full and complete study of classified technologies connected to this subject to see how they could be properly declassified and applied for peaceful energy generation.
Hmm.
Obviously, that hasn't happened yet, but that is the thing that he is asking for that I think is most interesting. And I think
Yeah.
he phrased it really interestingly. He doesn't say, "You have to tell us everything you know." He
Sure.
said, "This shit is improperly classified." And some of this is not only like earth shaking, but like literally climate saving technology. He's hearing that they have 0 point
Hmm.
energy, that they've got, advanced antimatter stuff, that they've got all these power generation things that they're just not sharing. Stuff that could fix the climate, the energy crisis
Right.
overnight, basically, and could eventually lead to a reversal of global warming and stuff like that. I'm kind of with them on that. If the military is sitting on tech that they are developing for military reasons, but could have civilian applications like this, if they are not disclosing it, that's fucking criminal. And I like that he doesn't say you need to just tell us everything. He says you need to look at how it can be properly declassified and applied for peaceful use. I find it really hard to object to that idea. Like, if you believe that they have recovered extraterrestrial technology, I understand why your instinct would be to hold it and keep it secret for military purposes. But the world's kind of a shit show right now. Like, this isn't the time to be camping on tech that could help us out and, not have Florida be underwater in 10 years.
Right. Yeah, I this strikes me like I love it. Just to be clear, I love the idea, but it also strikes me that that is such a like mind-numbingly fertile field that if
Uh-huh.
we had that technology, I don't care how classified it is, that would get out. Like some
Maybe.
general,
Yeah.
some four-star general would retire
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
have a great idea.
This
And
is this is a topic that comes up often in the UFO community. My dad, who worked at the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, was
yeah,
fond of saying that having been a government employee, I do not believe that the government is capable of keeping it a secret. It's just
yeah,
it is too
yeah,
poorly organized to be able to handle something of this scale. I
yeah.
don't agree with that. The most obvious example is Los Alamos and the National Bomb Project. But,
Sure.
like, we have examples of us successfully keeping secrets, including every spy plane that's been developed. That doesn't necessarily extend to this scale, but I will grant you that there is plenty of room to disagree here about whether or not the government and the military are capable of keeping a secret on this scale. Now, we have talked a little bit through the Admiral Wilson memo about the way that they handle research on this is every 5 to 10 years, they pull the stuff out of the Indiana Jones storage area, bring
Yeah.
in some scientists who have security clearances, have them study it, and make zero progress. And then they make them all sign
Yeah.
NDAs, send them away, and put the shit back in storage for 5 or 10 years until we
Right.
make some more material science progress. That that makes sense to me. And if that's the case, I kind of understand how like they're not sitting on 0 point energy. They're sitting on something that can do 0 point energy, but we don't understand how it works. Like what do you want us to
Right.
do? Like plug this thing into the grid? We don't know how to do that.
Exactly.
Like
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I guess I see that like and so to refute the statement about stealth planes, we do not keep those secret very well.
all right, fair,
But
fair.
uh, but but to your point, like if we really are only letting in a few people every year or every 10 years or whatever, yeah, all right, maybe. But I agree with you that like it's definitely not something we can plug in, and so
Yeah,
releasing it might get us closer, but it
right.
might just lead to 1,000 scientists who have no idea what to do with it.
And there's two obvious concerns here, right? One is nuclear technology is a concern because while it is
Well,
capable of mass amounts of power generation, it is also capable of mass amounts of destruction. And an endless
sure.
concern has been terrorists getting their hands on dirty bombs. If you have people who know how to do nuclear power, almost by definition, they can figure out how to make a dirty bomb. That ain't great.
Yeah,
Maybe this is a similar kind of thing. Sure, there's this incredible power, but it
probably.
is so unbelievably easy to turn it destructive that we cannot possibly trust people with it. I'm
Oh
not
yeah,
sure I buy that argument, but I could kind of see how you could end up in the world of this has to be protected.
yeah,
The other thing is the idea of you clearly know something, you have to tell it to us. It's not good science, right? It's not a falsifiable thing. Because
yeah,
if they say, no, we don't, or we've told you everything we know, okay, have you? We have no way of knowing.
yeah.
Like
Right.
they can come out and
Yeah,
throw us a crumb and they're still sitting. So,
yeah,
like I love Steven Greer to death for having this conference. I love that he had big, audacious ideas, and I love that he had
yeah,
clearly stated goals. And I think on the whole, he had a positive impact on the community
yeah.
by starting this conversation and asking for these things in particular. And he introduced a number of witnesses who have become kind of big deal names. Now, some of the witnesses he brought out, I'm not even going to talk about today because they have since been debunked, or the things they were
Okay.
claiming were just like kind of out of nowhere. But a few of the stories that you heard were real, real interesting. Um,
Okay.
and I'm about to start diving into it. But before I do, I want to remind you that, our kind of point of view on this project is not this is true, this isn't true. Our point of view
Sure.
is if this is true,
Woo.
whew, it's a very exciting time. And several of the things we hear here, 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 uh, fall into that category of could be exciting.
Yeah.
The one
Okay.
last thing I'll say before we dive into witnesses is Steven Greer closes up. He goes, okay, because he's talking to the press, right? All these
Yeah.
like journalists who showed up to hear him raving about UFOs. He says, we
Yeah.
have a document for you. Okay, great. We're going to, please hold your questions. We're going to give you this document with more information. These people are just going to give you kind of a summary of what's going on. That document was a 500-page document
Yep.
accompanied by a 4 hour long videotape summary. He
Wow.
later had to put out a summary, an executive
Of
summary
the
of the
summary.
Disclosure Project document, which was itself like 200 pages. I
Oh my
flipped
gosh.
through this PDF. It's readily available. It is
Yeah.
bonkers. Like, it is full of so much stuff. But all that said, I still think he did a great job. He got some good witnesses. So
Yeah.
I've got
Okay.
6 witnesses I want to talk about here. I'm
Okay.
not going to get super into details, but yeah, let me know if you have any questions. Also, I want to be clear. I'm going to be a little unclear on these people's ranks. Like, a bunch of them are
Okay.
military. It's because they did not do a good job of introducing themselves or saying Are
Okay.
you saying this was your rank when the incident you're describing happened? Are you saying you retired with this
Uh,
rank? Were you discharged honorably or not? Like, do you still, because
right.
I don't know a whole lot about how retired people keep their ranks. So some of them were identified as person X, this rank, U.S. Air Force retired. Some of them were just Mr. X. And he said, I worked at the Air Force and held this rank. Is
Hmm.
there a difference between how you, I don't know. They didn't
Oh,
tell
yeah,
us.
interesting.
So
Okay.
I assume that was an act of sloppiness on the part of the organizers as opposed to an attempt to conceal that some of these are not credible witnesses. But if it seems unclear what some of these people's ranks are, it's because it is. So the first story, uh, this is John Callahan, who was the FAA head of accidents and investigations. And he got up and told this short, punchy story that I loved. He said, in December of 1986, I received a call from my Alaska region wanting to know what they could tell the media. I said, tell the media about what? He said, about the UFO. I said, what UFO? The conversation went downhill from there.
Okay.
uh, he said he eventually told them, give the standard government office response to the media, which is, we're investigating it. And in the meantime, send all the information you have to me. Now, we now know that what he's referring to is Japanese Airlines 1628, which was an encounter in Alaska where this Japanese Airlines pilot and his aircrew saw odd lights outside their ship.
Hmm. Okay.
That case has been quote unquote debunked, but we're talking like no, they saw Venus, right? So
Hmm.
I'm not here to pass judgment on whether or not they saw anything, but that's the case he's describing. And it was in the press. Like a lot of people were talking about it on the news at the time. So they were calling the FAA for a statement. He says, send me the information. So they send all the information to their facility, and they were able to play back the radar tracks and the pilot audio and reconstruct the event. And they're able to see, yes, the ground radar and the aircraft radar are picking up an object. The pilots are describing it. Um, Long story short, they end up briefing President Reagan's science staff as well as some men from the CIA and FBI. After the briefing is done, the CIA guy says, this event never happened and this meeting never happened.
Okay. Seems
He
very
says,
CIA.
yeah, right. He says, I asked why. I thought it was probably just a stealth bomber. He says, well, this is the first time we've recorded radar data on a UFO. I said, well, you're going to tell the public about this. He says, no, we don't tell the public about this. It would cause a panic. We're going to go back and study this. Due to a weird situation that he goes on to describe, John Callahan still has the voice tapes, video, FAA
Huh.
report, printouts of the radar data, everything. And he closes by saying, I'm prepared to go before Congress and swear that everything I've told you people is the truth.
Okay.
Everyone who got up on the stage said some variation of that. This is what I saw. I am prepared to go
Yeah.
before Congress and testify. Which, again, I appreciate that Steven Greer didn't just pull these people together and say, hey, tell me what you saw. He's like, would you be willing to testify under oath
Yeah.
about this? And they're all saying yes. And most of them are bringing like material to back up what they're saying. He's not just telling a story, he has the tapes and the radar track.
Yeah. That's cool.
The next guy I thought was really interesting because we get a little bit of insight into standard NORAD procedures around UFOs at
Hmm.
the time. So this
Okay.
guy is Sergeant Michael Smith. He was a U.S. Air Force radar controller. He said in 1970 he saw a UFO on radar in Klamath Falls, Oregon, hovering at 80,000 feet. It slowly descended until it dropped off the radar, gone for 5 or 10 minutes, and then it reappeared at 80,000 feet. Then the next sweep of the radar, it's 200 miles away.
Hmm.
Hovers at 80,000 feet for about 10 minutes, drops down slowly until it disappears off radar, reappears. Saw this whole cycle repeat several times. He was told at the time that the normal procedure was to notify NORAD, but don't write anything down because it's need to know. He says later that year, he got a call from NORAD that a UFO was coming up the California coastline. He said, "What should I do about this?" They said, "Nothing. Don't write it down. This is just a heads up." He says late in 1972, he got a panicky call from some police officers who were chasing 3 UFOs. He was able to verify that he could see these on radar. He called NORAD, and NORAD, the way he tells it, they sound annoyed because they have to reroute 2 incoming B-52s that were going to land at the nearby airbase because there's a
Okay.
flight safety hazard in the way.
Yeah,
They're
right.
not doing anything about it. They don't tell him to do anything. They're just like, "Oh, okay, I guess we'll reroute these jets we got
Oh my
coming in."
gosh.
Um, and he said he received several calls from the police that night, and his standard response was, "There's nothing on radar."
Hmm.
Uh, Now, he didn't bring any evidence. He didn't, have
Okay.
like radar tracks or anything, but I find it extremely believable and in line with what we're hearing from other people that the standard response to these unknown objects was, "I don't know, man. Don't tell anybody about it. It's not good for your career."
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that's true. I've heard that as well.
All right. Now, these next two, buckle up, buddy. These two are kind of buck
Okay.
wild.
I'm
And
jazzed.
I
Let's do
should
it.
say, as always, I'm fully prepared for you to not believe these, but they are great stories. And if they're true,
Okay.
whew.
Woo.
All right. Sergeant Carl Wolf. He was a precision electronics photographic repairman with top secret
Mm,
clearance in the U.S. Air Force. This is in 1965. So we're talking like
okay.
dark rooms and negatives and photo print making equipment.
Yeah.
He says he was specifically one of the only photographic repairmen who was trained on the color printing uh,
Oh,
uh, photo machines.
yeah, that's
He
interesting.
says he was loaned to the Lunar Orbiter project at NASA to
Hmm.
help solve a problem with a piece of equipment that had become a bottleneck for their production of photographs. While waiting for the equipment to be removed from the darkroom because he couldn't operate it in the dark, he was asking the airman who worked there about how the equipment worked and how it got the data from the lunar orbiter. And the other guy's happy to chat with him. So they spend about a half hour talking about how the lunar orbiter sends the photographic data back and they reassemble it into something they can print, all that. Um, he said, about 30 minutes in, this airman said in a very distressed way, "By the way, we've discovered a base on the backside of the moon." And then he puts down a bunch of photos clearly showing structures, mushroom shaped and spherical buildings and towers. Now, Sergeant Carl Wolf, his reaction appropriately is, "Holy shit, I'm going to get in
Whoa.
trouble for this." Like,
Yeah,
this
right.
is, I am not cleared for this, buddy. And he says, "I asked no questions."
Yep.
And he's terrified someone's going to come in. And sure enough, a minute later, someone did come in, and the guy had to kind of like clear the photos away. He's like, so he feels like he kind of dodged a bullet. Uh,
Right.
he says he worked there for a few more days, and he says, and I remember going home and naively thinking, "Boy, I can't wait to hear about this on the evening news."
Right. Yeah. I mean,
Now,
we did hear about something like that on there were some photos from Mars, I think, that everyone
yeah,
was certain was a base. And
there
um,
are multiple people over the years who have made the claim that NASA photos are airbrushed before they are sent to the public.
okay. Yeah.
And it's one
Yeah.
of those things where it's impossible to deny, right? NASA comes out and
Yeah,
says,
right.
"No, we don't do that. Of course we don't do that. We're a science organization."
Right.
But if there was a military branch of NASA who was making them do it, they of course they wouldn't tell the public about it. So it's one of those perfect conspiracy theories because nobody can say it's not happening. You would have to be
Right.
there seeing the process to know for sure. Uh,
Right.
there were a couple other stories from this press conference where they talked about airbrushing photos. I'm not going to get into them. Some of them have been debunked, but
Okay.
this particular one with the claim of seeing photos of a base on the backside of the moon, I thought was tip top.
Yeah. That's interesting.
All right. Up next, we got Mark McCandlish, who was a conceptual artist for a variety of defense contractors, in particular for the
Ooh,
U.S. Air Force. And he holds up a bunch of like concept art that he made for,
yeah,
hypersonic spy planes and various things like that over the years. So this
that's
is
cool.
one of those concept artists that gets hired for JPL and places like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
He says in 1967 he saw a UFO hover over a nuclear weapons storage facility in Westover Air Force Base, which took off with an acceleration like a bullet leaving a rifle barrel. Interestingly, that's not the story he's here to tell. He just kind of casually drops like, "Oh, also I saw a UFO when I was a kid."
Okay.
His main story is in 1988, he and a college buddy were supposed to go to Norton Air Force Base for an air show where they were going to be like showing off a bunch of airplanes and stuff. He wasn't able to go. He had a big high priority job. He ended up not going,
Hmm.
but he asked his buddy about it later, and his buddy says he saw three flying saucers in a very large hangar. Now, we've heard either this story or a
Yeah.
similar story from a few different people over the years. But so he hears this, and his response, I think, is fascinating. He doesn't go, "Oh, that's really interesting," and think nothing about it. He doesn't go, "Oh, my buddy's crazy." He goes,
Right.
"I'm going to call my congressman,"
Yeah.
because his congressman at the time was the chair of the Congressional Committee on Space Science. He would have been at this air show, and he
Yeah.
assumes his office would have been briefed about it. So he gets on the phone, and a staff member confirms that the exhibit showed three discs hovering off the floor with no means of support. They were referred to as alien reproduction vehicles.
Huh.
They were nicknamed the flux liner because they used high voltage electricity. I don't want to get super into the weeds here,
Yeah.
but this
Okay.
aligns pretty tightly with Bob Lazar's claims.
Okay.
Now, what's funny about it, remember this guy is a concept artist. He gets together with his buddy who makes a sketch of everything he saw, including like inside the saucers and stuff like that.
Okay.
And he produces a high quality blueprint of it. Now, this blueprint is based on a third party description, but like
Sure.
he gets this made. So he has this blueprint of the flux liner. Uh, he then goes on to tell a few stories validating what he saw. He says, first of all, a military pilot who saw one in flight later confirmed, yes, this is exactly what it looks like. They kind of look like a cereal
Hmm.
bowl with this like thing on top. Another airman who saw one at Edwards Air Force Base. But most importantly, his college buddy ended up giving a copy of the diagram to the famous aeronautical designer Bert Rutan around 1994. Bert assumes it's a joke, has it framed and hung on the wall of his office. He thinks it's funny.
Naturally. Yeah.
A visiting Air Force colonel saw it and registered, I'm quoting here, registered quite a degree of shock and anger and wanted to know where the hell he got this blueprint because there was, in fact, such a craft at that time in a hangar at Edwards Air Force Base.
Oh.
Uh, he also later found declassified documents showing the Air Force was wind tunnel testing flying saucer shapes up to Mach 20. Anyway,
Wow.
it's just an interesting story. So he is not saying he's ever seen it. He's just the guy that made this drawing, but it's based on testimony from all these people, and it's got all this kind of like vaguely supportive evidence. So like I'm not saying it's conclusive, but it's a fun story. So
Yeah.
yeah, we now have multiple people talking about alien reproduction vehicles. This idea that recovered crashed wreckage has been reverse engineered, and we have produced some of these anti-gravity vehicles.
That is a really cool image, by the way.
Right?
I just
Yeah.
Googled it.
Oh yeah. The
Huh.
blueprint is awesome. Yeah.
Yeah. We
Um,
should totally get these.
yeah, totally. Okay, so these last two stories I want to talk about are I don't know if this was the first time that it came out or not, but these have since become legendary stories in the UFO community on their own right. So
Okay.
Up first, we have Captain Robert Salas of the U.S. Air Force. Now, this guy is all over the UFO community. He has spoken publicly about this for years. He was in Leslie Kean's book. He's written his own stuff. Um, but the short version of his story is he was stationed at Malmstrom Air Force Base as a missile launch officer. Early in the morning on March 16th, 1967, he was in a capsule 60 feet underground, monitoring and controlling 10 nuclear Minuteman missiles. Now, when he says capsule underground, I am assuming this is kind of a bomb shelter launch facility kind of thing, right? You don't want the
Hmm.
guy who can push the launch button to get taken out in first strike. Um, but
Sure.
anyway, he says he's underground. He gets a call from a security officer upstairs reporting strange lights in the sky. He completely disregards this, says, "Call me when
Yeah.
something more significant happens."
Yeah. Yeah.
Later, he gets another call. The guard is now clearly frightened, reporting a glowing red oval object hovering outside the front gate. He says
Huh.
they have their weapons drawn and they don't know what to do. So he calls the base commander to tell him. And as he does this, his missiles start going offline, one after the other, into
Huh.
a no-go condition. Within minutes of the call from the front gate, 6 to 8 of his 10 missiles were lost. He was later told that a similar incident happened at another missile facility where they lost all 10 missiles, and they were also reporting UFOs over those sites. He has documentation from Freedom of Information Act requests. Uh, there was an official report made which raised grave concerns, and no apparent reason for the loss of the missiles was ever identified. It wasn't like they came in and went, "Oh, there's a loose wire." Like, there was no reason these missiles should have gone offline. Actually, another witness later in the same press conference testified that he had spoken to one of the guys who investigated the missiles, and he told him
Hmm.
those missiles were clean as a whistle.
Huh. Weird.
Yeah.
Okay. Like I don't know. I want to dig into that. Like I don't know. That's
Unfortunately, there's
bizarre.
not a lot to dig into. But
Yeah.
if
Right.
you read UFOs and Nukes, which is an interesting book, or Leslie Kean's
Yeah.
book, they talk about this. But basically, there is a small set of fairly well documented encounters of UFOs over nuclear missile facilities actively interfering with the missiles.
Yeah.
In the US case, every time that they did, the missiles were shut down. There is a different case from Russia of a UFO over a nuclear facility where apparently the same thing happened, but the missile was armed.
Hmm.
And like they're
Oh,
panicking
interesting.
trying to stop it from launching. Now, the shitty child of the 80s that I am thinks like, oh yeah, the Russian missiles weren't wired as well, and whatever the aliens did
Yeah. Right.
accidentally triggered it instead of shutting it down. But who knows, right?
Right.
I don't know if that incident happened, but there are multiple incidents like this recorded, and I find it kind of fascinating. This is
Yeah.
one of the reports here that I give the most credence to, just
Yeah.
because there's so much corroborating evidence around the idea of UFOs surveilling military facilities and especially nuclear military facilities.
Yeah.
Now, we talked about this earlier. Does this mean that the UFOs have a particular interest in our nukes, or is it just that these are some of the most heavily surveilled sites on the planet,
Right.
and
Yeah.
they're more likely to spot an unidentified flying object hovering overhead than somewhere
Yeah.
else where maybe the guards don't look up at 2 in the morning? I don't know.
Right.
Your guess is as
Yeah.
good as mine, but it
Right.
is indisputable that these incidents are happening, and I find that fascinating.
Yeah. Totally. Okay. It's interesting.
All right. And the last one I want to talk to you about is the Rendlesham Forest incident. So the
Ooh.
guy who testified here is Larry Warren, who is a UFO officer. UFO officer, I'm sorry. He was a U.S. Air Force officer, security officer, assigned to RAF Bentwaters Woodbridge NATO Air Force facilities in Suffolk, England. Um,
God,
this is
the,
one
the
of those.
British names are just so British.
It's
Like,
crazy. But what it basically boils down to is there was, as far as I can tell, what amounted to a U.S. airbase in Britain right next to a
Sure,
British airbase. And there's
sure.
a little bit of tension between the Brits and the
Oh,
Americans.
interesting.
This story has since become famous. I'll talk about it in a minute. But one of the like debunker stories is British paratroopers tried to land in the woods outside the American base to
Hmm.
kind of basically to prank them, but like to
Yeah.
test their security. The American officers came out and just beat the holy hell out of these guys
Yeah.
and listed them on the official report as unregistered aliens. And they decided that, oh, okay, you're going to call us aliens. And then they staged a UFO landing to fuck with the
Uh-huh.
Americans. I don't think that's what happened, but it makes a pretty good fucking story about the
It
idea of
does.
these
It
Brits and
does.
Americans like, fuck you.
Yeah. Totally imagine that
Um,
happening.
right. So anyway, he's assigned to this base. They're guarding nuclear weapons that are secretly stored there. He makes the point that the Brits didn't know there were nuclear weapons stored there, or at least the British public didn't know,
Uh-huh.
which also feels very American.
Checks out.
So he briefly talked about this incident, which I don't have time to get into the whole thing of it today, but
Sure.
basically in December of 1980, there was an event that happened over the course of 3 nights where UFOs made incursions over the base. They fired pencil thin beams of light towards the nuclear ordnance.
Hmm.
The base commander, Charles Holt, wrote a memo about this and produced an audio tape of him going out in the woods and trying to pursue it. Um,
Hmm.
some of the airmen who went out to investigate claimed to have seen a landed UFO, a weird kind of pyramid shaped structure in the woods.
Hmm.
It was like 4 feet tall, like 3 feet wide. And every time they tried to approach it, it would hover up about 6 feet in the air and retreat through the woods and settle again somewhere else. Like, it
It
wasn't
sounds
fucking with
like
them.
one
It
of
just
those
like
useless
didn't want to be
boxes.
touched. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, right.
totally. Um, this story is extremely controversial. It is an extremely well-known
Sure.
story. It is often referred to as Britain's Roswell. It has had the attention of so many skeptics and debunkers over the years that kind of like we haven't talked about Roswell on this show because
Right.
Roswell is kind of poisoned at this point. There's so
Mm.
much evidence
Yeah.
both for and against Roswell that I think it's almost useless to talk about because it could be anything. And this
Yeah.
similarly, there are some pretty damning bits of skeptical testimony. For example, in the tape that Commander Holt has describing going through the woods, he reports seeing a light off in the distance, disappears, and then he says the light's back. And people have timed it, and that is exactly the duration of the lighthouse. It's about 2 miles away from the airbase,
Okay.
which is
Interesting.
only visible from this one little spot in the
Yeah,
woods.
right.
So maybe he would. That's a pretty damning bit of evidence against
Yeah.
it. On the other hand, anybody who's like, "Oh, it's a lighthouse," is ignoring the testimony of the soldiers who are saying they saw a physical UFO in the woods. Commander Holt also talks about this weird light, like moving around in the woods, almost taunting them. It ignores the people who report the beams of light coming down. So
Yeah, right.
I'm not saying it happened, but I'm saying it's a big case. And one of the guys who testified here was talking about that case. Um,
Yeah. I mean,
so all of
just
that
because
is to
one
say,
thing just because
right,
one thing is wrong doesn't mean that everything is.
exactly. Yeah. Um, so that's the that's the press conference. At this
Okay.
point, Steven Greer comes out and he kind of summarizes. They ask him like, "Are these witnesses reliable?" He tells this weird story about being a doctor with patients trying to get drugs.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Uh-huh.
he talks a little more about the idea of what he's really upset about is this idea that these black programs have gotten away with being improperly supervised. This is a violation of the Constitution. He did a pretty good job of like sticking the landing. Um, what I find most fascinating about this is they got a bit of press, but as far as I can tell, nothing came of it. Like
Yeah,
there obviously were no congressional hearings. President,
right.
Bush didn't care about this. Um, it made a big deal in the UFO community. A bunch of the witnesses he brought out were
Sure.
either
Yeah.
debunked or are still kind of celebrated as credible witnesses. It brought some of these stories to the forefront. And I think he did a good job of stating a reasonable set of goals of, hey,
Yeah.
if this is true, and the US government has what amounts to a rogue military research department, that's a big deal. And we should be talking
Yeah.
about it and looking
We
into
should.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, Steven Greer has kind of gone off the rails since, and I'm not here to validate him or
Yeah.
stand up for Steven Greer, but I am incredibly grateful to him for holding this press
Yeah.
conference. I think it's fascinating. I think the witnesses he brought forth are interesting, if not
Totally.
necessarily like 100% credible. As usual, what we see with Stephen Greer, Leslie Kane, and people like them is basically bringing out these people who have these stories and saying, listen, there is a prevailing narrative that the only people who see UFOs are nut jobs and rednecks and, people drunk on moonshine in the middle of the Tennessee woods or whatever. That's
Right.
not what we're seeing. We are seeing highly credible witnesses who are demonstrably not suffering from mental problems, are regularly evaluated, still hold security clearances, are trusted to make mission critical decisions. And at some point, you have to ask if you're saying that this stuff is obviously bunk, but you're trusting these people, where's the disconnect?
Right.
Either you
Yeah.
trust them or you don't. And since you do clearly trust them, what do we do about the fact that they're saying some
Yeah.
fairly alarming things?
Right. Yeah. And so I'm after this, I'm going to hang out with a very like kooky individual, but he surrounds himself by just the most wonderful people and has like an incredibly positive effect on the world. And I feel like maybe Stephen Greer is kind of like this too, where like I would not trust the guy I'm about to hang out with. Like anything he says is suspect to me, but I
Right,
do enjoy being around him and the people
right.
around him, and he just attracts all these marvelous humans. So I don't
Yeah.
know. I think that's fine.
So yeah, buddy,
Um,
that's
so,
Stephen Greer.
so
We've
all
been
right.
kind of dancing around
Here's
him for a while.
yeah, right. So here's my question: If you were at this press conference as a press person, what would you have asked?
Oh man, that's a good question. Uh, I would like to think I would have because for me, when I hear these stories, I have a tendency to kind of discount the most extreme 20% of what I'm hearing,
Sure. Yeah.
right? If I'm hearing, hey, pilots are seeing unidentified objects and they're showing up on radar tracks, and military witnesses are testifying to all of that, and 1 out of 10 of them says, oh, and also I saw an alien come out and abduct my buddy Bob, and oh, I was taken to a base on the dark side of the moon, and oh, I met a guy who said that,
All right.
these things are cryptoterrestrials who live in the center of the earth, right? Like,
Oh,
the most extreme of these I tend to discount, whether I think
sure.
that they're interesting or believable or not, but just because, like a bell curve, right? If you
Sure.
graph all
Yeah.
of these onto a bell curve, the ones at both extreme ends, I tend to kind of like look away and I'm focused on the meat in the middle. In
Right.
this case, the meat in the middle that he's talking about is credible witnesses to unidentified flying objects and credible witnesses testifying to the existence of black budget programs that seem to be operating without oversight or authority.
Hmm.
Those two things are things I can believe in and accept and investigate without necessarily going to, And it's because the Bigfoot is flying the UFOs from Venus.
Right,
Like
yeah.
who's in the craft and what the black budget programs are investigating can almost be set aside as irrelevant to what are pilots seeing and why aren't we investigating it and taking it seriously? And if there is credible evidence that there are black budget programs, why aren't we investigating that and trying to get this back under properly supervised control? You and I have talked offline about this. Do I want to know everything that's going on? Do I want disclosure with a capital D to happen and the government come out and say, here's what happened, y'all. Roswell was this, and
Yeah.
we did this, and we have this, and we're doing this, and we've got a treaty with this. Yeah, of course. But what I find concerning is the idea that what is in theory the greatest military in the world is just routinely ignoring things that don't fit
Mm,
our preconceived view of what's happening in the world and is at
sure,
risk
yeah.
of missing things. That's concerning to me. And
Yeah.
if there are these programs operating unaccountably, I'm more concerned that they get back to a point where they are operating accountably than I am with whether or not I, as an individual, find out. Yes, I want to know, but I'm more concerned. So I would like to think that if I was there as a news person hearing this stuff, I would focus in on the more actionable part and be asking follow-up questions about these black budget programs and how do you know about them and where are you finding out about this and what information can you give me so that I can go out
Okay.
and investigate it and follow up on it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know.
And I
Is that
sort
a
of I
satisfying answer?
yeah, no, that's really good. While you were talking, I found myself wondering whether this research actually had to be under a black budget, or if you could hide it just as well, um, in the light and under a confusing name or whatever. Um,
Yeah, yeah. And if you start going down the rabbit hole of, well, why is it black budget? Like, if we accept that there is a conspiracy here, that, some rogue faction of the military or private industry has taken this and hidden it from the government and the president and proper accountability procedures, the question becomes why? Like, because we
yeah,
already
right.
have proper procedures for doing this kind of stuff. Like off the records research and development does happen. That there are protocols for this. Why do you feel the need to operate outside of it? And the most credible thing that I have heard is basically, sorry, the most plausible reasoning I have heard is that this started out under like Truman, like post World War II, with people investigating it and finding out, hey, there's something here, and we're already operating in this world of military secrecy post World War II. We're already used to the idea
Yeah,
of secretive things that need to be kept from the public. They start investigating this, and over time, it kind of becomes self evident that it should remain secret. And the rumor is that Kennedy wanted to disclose, and he sent a memo saying, "Hey, get ready.
uh,
We're going to go public with this," and that's why they had him killed. I don't put a whole lot of stock in
uh,
that, but substitute Kennedy with literally anybody. At
sure,
some
yeah,
point, there is some vibe that this is not going to stay secret any longer, and they have a choice: either go along with this and it will no longer be secret, or bury it deeper.
yeah,
And it looks like they buried it deeper. They took it and put it in the Department of Energy, which for a long time was responsible for nukes. It was largely free of
right.
oversight. And then eventually they started looking at the Department of Energy and they said, okay, now we're going to go bury it at,
Mm,
Lockheed, and through a private
right.
contractor. Only like 4 people in the military will actually know about it. So we're not technically breaking any laws.
Mm,
Like,
hmm.
I,
Yeah,
I find that narrative very believable, where it's not
yeah, me too.
necessarily a mustache twirling villain who's trying to keep a secret from the American public. The people who work on this project probably think of themselves as patriots, think of themselves as doing the right thing. This project
Right,
obviously has to be kept secret. People can't be
right.
trusted with it. The terrorist dirty bomb analogy we made earlier. But,
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
even more than that, some people talk about there's upsetting knowledge, like maybe the idea that
Hmm.
humans were an engineered species by these people, and the public can't handle that. So the information has.
Right.
I don't know. I don't know if any of that shit's
Sure.
true, but I can
Yeah.
I can think of 100 different reasons why this would go from a fairly well guarded military secret to an extremely well guarded military secret to a fuck this, we have to get it out of the military because nobody could ever know about this. And like
Right.
secrecy kind of becomes a self reinforcing thing over
Yeah. 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 That makes sense to me. I think that's a good answer. Yeah.
time. I forget what the question was. How did we get on this?
I don't know. I don't know. Our audience will tell us. Don't worry about
Yeah.
it.
Well, you know what, man? We, we have somehow landed on an hour 15 as kind of our like de
Hey.
facto
Yeah.
recording time. And I'm looking over, I'm
Yeah.
seeing we're at an hour 25 right now, which is within
Yeah.
spitting
Makes sense.
distance of normal. And considering that we
Yep.
added a whole extra topic today, I'm
Right.
feeling really good about it. If anybody's
Okay, good.
curious about the Disclosure Project or about Steven Greer's press conference, or about the Chinese spy balloons. As always, I'll have a bunch of links in the show notes to go learn a little more about it. But yeah, in a nutshell, in 2001, Stephen Greer held a really interesting press conference, and I think he deserves a lot of credit for being one of the first people to come out and say, listen, there are credible military government intelligence witnesses who are claiming crazy things, and we need to listen to them. And that was kind of a groundbreaking position at the time, and it's still a little controversial, but people like Leslie Kean and Ross Coulthard have followed in their footsteps. And I'm really grateful to Stephen Greer for getting that ball rolling, even if he has since become someone who, like your buddy, I wouldn't trust. I'm trailing off because Chuck just had to leave the room to chase his dog
No,
away.
no. My dog is singing to me right now, which is charming, but
Oh.
also very distracting.
All right. Well, you know what? I think we're about done. Chuck, as always, thank you for listening to me talk about UFOs so my wife doesn't have to.